The island lay beyond the edge of ordinary maps, a small fragment of land emerging from the South Pacific with steep cliffs and dense vegetation. From a distance, it appeared unremarkable, almost indistinct against the horizon, yet its isolation was immediate. Waves lapped consistently against jagged rocks, shaping a rhythmic soundscape that would remain constant for months. Salt-scented air carried faint traces of decaying vegetation and the occasional call of distant seabirds. Shorelines alternated between narrow pebble beaches and rough rock faces. Inland, the terrain rose sharply, covered in tangled shrubs and low trees. Occasional clearings revealed patches of sand and small pools of fresh water collected after rains. The soil was thin in many areas, and signs of erosion suggested that storms could reshape the island's surface in days. The climate was temperate, though humid, with sudden showers that left the ground slick and saturated. Insects were abundant, and small crabs scuttled across the tidal flats. Larger birds patrolled the skies, their flight patterns precise, seemingly aware of the island's solitude. There were no signs of habitation, no structures, paths, or remnants of human activity. Even the driftwood scattered along the beaches had been weathered for months, its origin uncertain. The island existed in quiet detachment, a world both self-contained and indifferent to any visitor. The first steps onto the sand were accompanied by a sense of suspension, as though the wider world had paused beyond the horizon. Sounds, textures, and spatial relationships dominated perception. There was no urgency, no immediate threat. The island's rhythm was steady, measured, and completely unaware of the person who had arrived to remain within it for the coming months. The island was located approximately 120 kilometers from the nearest inhabited landmass, situated within a sparsely traveled portion of the South Pacific. Satellite maps marked it only as a minor feature, unnamed in most navigational charts. Historically, it had been bypassed by explorers and traders, its rocky coasts offering little in the way of safe anchorage. Storms and shifting currents rendered approaches hazardous, and few vessels lingered in the surrounding waters. Access was limited. Only small, shallow-draft boats could land on the narrow beaches, and even then, tides and winds dictated windows of opportunity. Satellite imagery suggested that the island had never supported permanent human habitation. Vegetation patterns indicated minimal disturbance, and no trails or cleared areas suggested prior settlement. Driftwood and occasional debris were the only signs of interaction with the outside world. The isolation created a unique ecosystem. Crabs, seabirds, and small reptiles thrived with limited predation. Mangroves and shrubs formed natural barriers along low-lying areas, while higher ground supported hardy trees adapted to wind and salt spray. Seasonal rainfall left temporary streams and pools, which influenced animal movement and vegetation density. The island existed as a closed system, detached from human influence, with its rhythms dictated solely by tides, wind, and rainfall. For anyone arriving without preparation, the combination of remoteness and self-contained ecology meant that survival depended entirely on observation, adaptation, and patience. The person stranded on the island was Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor born in 1676 in Lower Largo, Fife. By the time of his voyage, Selkirk had already spent years at sea, gaining practical experience with navigation, seamanship, and the demands of life aboard a ship. His early life had exposed him to both the discipline of work and the independence required in maritime trades. Selkirk joined the Royal Navy as a young man but later transitioned to privateering and merchant voyages. He was known for his meticulous nature, careful attention to supplies, and willingness to work in challenging conditions. These skills would become critical during his isolation. His background did not include formal survival training in wilderness or uninhabited islands. Instead, he relied on observation, intuition, and the skills honed during long periods at sea. At the time of the voyage that led to his isolation, Selkirk had signed on with the privateering expedition commanded by Woodes Rogers. The crew aimed to raid Spanish holdings along the South American coast and capture valuable cargo. Selkirk, experienced in both navigation and the management of shipboard provisions, was a valuable member of the crew. He understood how to ration food, maintain tools, and adapt to unexpected circumstances, though he could not have anticipated the circumstances that would leave him alone on an island for nearly 2 years. Selkirk's temperament also influenced how he approached survival. He was known among peers as cautious, principled, and occasionally stubborn. These traits played a dual role during his isolation. They allowed him to make careful decisions regarding shelter, food, and escape attempts, yet also required constant vigilance to avoid the psychological strain of prolonged solitude. His initial landing on the island followed a disagreement with the ship's captain regarding the seaworthiness of the vessel. Selkirk believed the ship was unsafe and requested to be put ashore temporarily. What he could not have foreseen was that the ship would depart without him, leaving him stranded. At that moment, the context shifted from temporary precaution to permanent isolation. His prior experience at sea, combined with practical skills, would determine whether he could endure the island's isolation and survive until rescue. Selkirk's story is documented in journals and accounts by Roger's crew, corroborated by letters and official records. The precise details of daily life during the first weeks on the island are scarce, but his known maritime skills and self-reliant character provide insight into how he approached the challenges ahead. The decisive moment occurred in September 1704. Selkirk, having requested to be left on the island of Masa Tierra, part of the Juan Fernandez archipelago off the coast of Chile, expected a temporary stay while the ship conducted repairs. The captain, however, chose to continue the voyage without him. By the time Selkirk realized the ship had departed, there was no possibility of immediate return. The horizon held only open water, and the currents and winds offered no hope of interception. The island's isolation was absolute. The nearest inhabited land was hundreds of kilometers away, separated by treacherous currents and unpredictable weather. Selkirk's first observation of the shoreline reflected a stark understanding: he was alone, entirely dependent on the island's resources. There were no settlements, no signs of human activity, and no immediate means of signaling for help. In the initial hours, he surveyed the terrain. Rocky cliffs bordered parts of the coast, while sandy coves provided potential landing points. Streams from the island's interior offered fresh water, though their flow varied with rainfall. Selkirk noted the abundance of local wildlife, birds, crabs, and small goats that had been introduced in previous expeditions. These observations would inform his strategy for sustenance and shelter. The psychological weight of isolation set in gradually. Without companionship, there was no external confirmation of safety or progress. Every decision, where to establish a camp, what to eat, how to protect himself from exposure, now carried permanent consequences. Mistakes could be fatal, and there was no external assistance. From that point forward, Selkirk's survival was no longer optional, it was inevitable. The island's rhythms, tides, weather, daylight, became the parameters of his existence. Each day would demand careful attention, adaptation, and perseverance. The shift from temporary precaution to full isolation marked the beginning of a prolonged confrontation with solitude and the natural environment. Selkirk's awareness of the island's permanence transformed his actions. Gathering resources, identifying safe shelter, and observing animal behavior were no longer preparatory steps, they were immediate necessities. The horizon, once a promise of return, had become a boundary. His survival would depend on discipline, observation, and the application of all skills acquired in years at sea. In the weeks following his isolation, Selkirk began to create a daily structure to sustain life. The first priority was shelter. He selected a site on a slope slightly elevated from the tidal zone, balancing protection from high tides with proximity to fresh water. Using driftwood and branches from the island's sparse trees, he constructed a basic hut. Rocks and smaller stones were used to stabilize the structure, and he lined the floor with vegetation to provide insulation against damp ground. Over time, the shelter evolved, incorporating improvements to withstand wind and rain. Securing potable water was critical. Selkirk identified natural streams and freshwater pools fed by rainfall. He dug small channels and used rocks to direct water into containers he fashioned from hollowed-out logs and shells. He remained attentive to seasonal fluctuations, noting when pools dried or streams swelled. This awareness became essential for planning daily activity. Food acquisition required observation and patience. The island supported a population of goats, introduced during prior visits by sailors, which became a primary source of protein. Selkirk constructed simple snares to capture smaller animals and relied on fishing along sheltered coves, using improvised hooks from bones and lines from plant fibers. Edible plants, fruits, and shellfish supplemented his diet. He carefully rationed these resources to ensure sustained availability, noting patterns in wildlife behavior and tidal cycles. Tools were rudimentary but functional. Selkirk fashioned knives from salvaged metal and shaped wooden implements for digging, shelter maintenance, and food preparation. Fire was maintained continuously when possible, both for warmth and cooking, and he developed techniques to protect it from sudden rainfall. His daily routine was disciplined. Morning was devoted to inspection of water sources and food supplies, midday to foraging or hunting, and evening to maintenance of shelter and tools. Observing the sun and stars became a method of orientation and timekeeping. Selkirk's routine mitigated the disorientation that can accompany isolation. Structure provided both efficiency and psychological stability. Mental strategies complemented physical routines. Selkirk cultivated awareness of the island's rhythms, using the repetition of chores to maintain focus and stave off despair. He documented his experiences mentally, noting animal patterns, weather changes, and successful techniques. These observations would later inform his decisions regarding shelter improvements and eventual plans for escape. Over several months, this systematic approach transformed the island from a place of immediate risk into an environment where survival was manageable. Basic necessities were addressed, and a sense of predictability emerged within the unpredictable. The island's hazards, storms, limited food, exposure, were mitigated through careful planning, observation, and adaptation. By the end of the first year, Selkirk's routine had become ingrained. Shelter, water, food, and fire were secured consistently, and small efficiencies in daily activity allowed for conservation of energy. The island's isolation, once overwhelming, was now a framework within which he could operate. Survival had shifted from reactive improvisation to methodical management of resources, setting the stage for the long-term endurance that would define his experience. Over the months that followed, Selkirk's existence on the island became a careful negotiation between physical necessity and psychological endurance. Isolation had initially presented itself as a stark, almost abstract reality, but gradually, it demanded structured attention to both body and mind. Daily survival required more than shelter, food, and water. It required an understanding of the environment's rhythms, the limits of his body, and the contours of solitude. Physically, Selkirk adapted to the island's demands with incremental changes. Walking long distances across uneven terrain strengthened his legs and core, while swimming along the coast, whether to gather shellfish or reach small inlets, maintained cardiovascular fitness. The climate presented alternating challenges. Intense sun exposure during the day necessitated improvised coverings crafted from leaves and woven fibers, while sudden rainstorms required protective measures to prevent hypothermia. Maintaining a fire became a daily ritual, crucial not only for cooking but for warmth and signaling. Nutrition was variable but sufficient. Goats provided protein and fat, while shellfish and birds supplemented this diet. Selkirk observed tidal and seasonal patterns to optimize hunting and gathering. Certain edible plants were available only briefly, and over time, he memorized their locations and growth cycles. Preservation techniques were limited, smoking meat over fire or drying in the sun was employed when possible. Rationing was instinctive, guided by an awareness that scarcity could be sudden and severe. Injuries and minor illnesses were managed with pragmatic solutions. Cuts, scrapes, or burns were treated with rinsing in seawater or freshwater and protection with leaves. Infections posed a constant risk. Without medical supplies, prevention became paramount. Selkirk monitored his own health, recognizing fatigue, fever, or inflammation as early warnings requiring rest and adjustment of activity. This attentiveness allowed him to survive without medical intervention for the duration of his isolation. Psychologically, adaptation was equally methodical. Selkirk confronted solitude by establishing routines that imposed temporal structure. Sunlight, tides, and stars marked days, while repetitive chores, feeding fires, repairing shelter, tracking animals, created a sense of continuity. Observation of wildlife provided a framework for interaction. Birds, crabs, and goats offered predictable patterns, allowing Selkirk to feel connected to the island's ecology without the need for human contact. Monotony was mitigated through purposeful labor and careful record-keeping in memory. Selkirk mentally catalogued plant species, animal behavior, and weather patterns. This mental engagement functioned as both practical planning and cognitive exercise, preserving sharpness and focus. He also experimented with minor innovations in tools and techniques, refining fishing hooks, snares, and shelter construction. These small successes reinforced a sense of competence and agency, crucial for long-term resilience. Time itself changed meaning. Days blended into weeks, and weeks into months, with the regularity of tides and the succession of seasons serving as the primary markers. Occasional storms or droughts punctuated the passage of time, but largely, Selkirk measured existence in terms of tasks completed and resources secured. Awareness of mortality remained constant, yet it did not dominate thought. Instead, survival became a disciplined engagement with immediate realities. Over the course of more than a year, the combination of physical conditioning, resource management, and psychological structure produced profound adaptation. Selkirk's body grew attuned to the island's environment, resilient to temperature fluctuations and variable nutrition. His mind developed strategies for coping with isolation, transforming solitude from a liability into a manageable context for sustained action. The cumulative effect of these adaptations was a quiet competence. Selkirk moved through the island with knowledge of where food could be found, which areas provided shelter from wind, and how to anticipate changes in weather. Mental and physical skills reinforced each other, attentive observation guided survival tasks, and the completion of those tasks sustained mental stability. By the second year of isolation, he had created an existence that was neither comfortable nor indulgent but reliably survivable. This period of adaptation also laid the foundation for what would later become escape. Mastery over resources, understanding of environmental patterns, and confidence in his own capabilities allowed Selkirk to begin considering long-term solutions beyond the island itself. Survival was no longer merely reactive, it was strategic, informed by the lessons accumulated through prolonged, uninterrupted engagement with the natural world. In this way, the island ceased to be merely a site of isolation and became a structured environment in which Selkirk's skills and discipline determined both daily survival and the possibility of eventual departure. Despite the disciplined routines Selkirk established, the island presented persistent and escalating challenges that tested both body and mind. Environmental pressures fluctuated unpredictably. Storms became more severe during certain seasons, bringing high winds and torrential rains that threatened his shelter. Wooden structures, though reinforced, required constant maintenance. Fallen branches and displaced rocks had to be cleared or repurposed, adding physical strain to an already demanding daily routine. Food sources were not entirely reliable. Goats, while abundant, required careful hunting and offered only intermittent availability. Over time, Selkirk recognized patterns in the animal's movement and breeding, but depletion was always a risk. Shellfish and birds supplemented the diet, yet tides and weather limited access. Seasonal variations in rainfall affected freshwater pools, sometimes leaving them nearly dry. These fluctuations demanded vigilance and improvisation, particularly during periods of scarcity. Isolation amplified the psychological burden. Days and weeks melded together with little distinction, and the monotony of survival tasks intensified awareness of solitude. Mental fatigue was compounded by the lack of external stimuli. Without companions or even the occasional passing ship, Selkirk's perception of time became elastic. Weeks could seem like months, months like years. This distortion reinforced the necessity of routine, yet even well-established practices could not fully eliminate the cognitive weight of enduring isolation. Physical challenges occasionally intensified when illness or minor injuries occurred. Cuts, scratches, and abrasions became more consequential in the humid environment, with heightened risk of infection. While Selkirk remained vigilant in cleaning wounds and preserving hygiene, there were times when discomfort and weakness limited activity. These episodes underscored the fragile balance between survival and overexertion. Attempts at escape prior to building a vessel were unsuccessful. Selkirk considered the surrounding waters but lacked both a seaworthy craft and sufficient supplies for a journey to inhabited land. Driftwood rafts were tested and abandoned. The prospect of leaving without preparation was recognized as likely fatal. Each failed attempt reinforced the necessity of patience, meticulous planning, and resource accumulation. Despite the accumulation of challenges, Selkirk's knowledge of the island continued to grow. He observed animal patterns, weather cycles, and tides with increasing precision. This expertise allowed him to mitigate risks, though never eliminate them entirely. Even as the island became familiar, it retained a degree of unpredictability that demanded constant attention. By the 17th month of isolation, Selkirk had endured repeated shortages, inclement weather, and physical strain, yet remained alive. His survival depended on an equilibrium of skill, discipline, and careful observation. The tension of scarcity and environmental pressure persisted, creating a prolonged period of physical and psychological stress that would define the final months on the island. After more than a year and a half on the island, Selkirk began preparing for a departure that would end his isolation. He recognized that survival alone was no longer sufficient. Without a means to leave, the island would remain permanent. The only viable option was to construct a seaworthy vessel capable of navigating the surrounding waters to reach inhabited land. Material collection became the initial focus. Selkirk scavenged driftwood, selecting pieces sturdy enough to form a hull yet light enough to manipulate alone. He salvaged rope remnants from debris washed ashore, and branches were trimmed and shaped into oars and structural supports. Stones and shells were employed to anchor components or serve as tools during construction. Every item was repurposed carefully, reflecting both resourcefulness and foresight. The process was methodical. Selkirk measured and aligned each component using rudimentary tools and intuition, continually testing stability. The hull was built incrementally, with attention to balance and buoyancy. He reinforced joints with rope bindings and natural adhesives where possible, relying on repeated trials to refine the design. Time was a critical factor. Selkirk coordinated construction with tides, weather patterns, and daylight hours. Storms threatened to damage incomplete structures, and sun exposure required careful pacing of labor. Daily routines were adapted to prioritize both survival and the gradual assembly of the craft. Mental focus remained as important as physical labor. The project required sustained concentration and patience, with every error potentially jeopardizing safety during eventual departure. Selkirk's prior experience at sea informed both design choices and expectations for the journey ahead. By the 19th month, the vessel was functional. It was small and rudimentary, yet sufficient to carry Selkirk safely from the island. The escape plan had transformed from a concept into a tangible, achievable objective, dependent on skill, observation, and months of disciplined effort. In the 19th month of isolation, Selkirk prepared to leave the island. The makeshift boat, assembled with driftwood, rope, and improvised joints, had undergone final inspections. He ensured that supplies, primarily freshwater stored in hollowed containers and a small amount of preserved food, were secured. Shelter and tools were left in a location that could serve him temporarily in the unlikely event of a return. Launching the vessel required careful timing. Selkirk observed tides and wind conditions to select the optimal moment. He waited for a calm morning, when waves along the rocky coastline were minimal. Each movement was deliberate, balancing the craft on the uneven beach and guiding it into the surf. Once afloat, he used the oars to maintain direction, conscious of both currents and the vessel's limited stability. The initial stretch was cautious. The surrounding waters were clear of obstacles, but the ocean's force was constant. Selkirk relied on his previous knowledge of currents and wind patterns to plot a course toward the nearest known inhabited island. His movements were measured, conserving energy while maintaining control. As the island receded from view, there was no elation or dramatic relief. Observation and focus dominated his experience. Waves, wind, and sun dictated pace, and the same attention to detail that had ensured survival on land now guided him at sea. Navigation was informed by the stars and the position of the sun, with careful consideration of drift and distance. After several hours of rowing and steering, Selkirk reached a larger vessel passing near the islands. He signaled using the minimal tools available, and the crew recognized him. Rescue was quiet and factual, there were no ceremonies, only acknowledgement of his survival. After 19 months, the island's isolation ended, but the memory of adaptation, discipline, and endurance remained. Selkirk's experience on Masa Tierra is a study in human resilience and adaptation. Isolated for 19 months, he transformed an unfamiliar, uninhabited island into a livable environment through observation, methodical planning, and disciplined labor. His survival was neither heroic nor dramatic, it was quiet, grounded in practical skill and careful attention to detail. The historical significance of his ordeal extends beyond individual endurance. Selkirk's story would later inspire the narrative of Robinson Crusoe, influencing literature and cultural understanding of human survival in isolation. It demonstrates the capacity to adapt to extreme environments using knowledge, resourcefulness, and sustained effort rather than relying on luck or improvisation alone. From a human perspective, the account highlights the interplay between mental and physical adaptation. Selkirk's discipline, routine, and attentiveness allowed him to manage both sustenance and solitude. The island's isolation became a framework for observation, planning, and incremental problem-solving. Each choice, from shelter construction to rationing, from fire maintenance to eventual boat building, was informed by experience, patience, and careful calculation. When he departed the island, there was no triumph, only the continuation of life in a broader context. His survival was acknowledged by the returning crew and recorded in journals, yet the narrative emphasizes endurance rather than spectacle. The island remained unchanged, indifferent, and complete in its ecosystem, while Selkirk returned to a world of human interaction, carrying the quiet imprint of months spent in self-reliance. Ultimately, the story endures as a testament to measured perseverance and skill. It invites reflection on human adaptability, the capacity to observe and learn from nature, and the quiet strength required to survive extended isolation. The island, once a site of potential peril, became a place where survival was systematically achieved, leaving only the enduring lesson of resilience.